I'm an emotional South African. I'm a South African who also experiences violence and trauma. Also, the vicarious living of violence, crime, and trauma. I work in an environment where every single day I am talking to people that have been experienced to crime one way or the other. But I also would like to see myself as some sort of logical South African. Let me look at the numbers. And what do the numbers tell me when it looks at the level and the rate of crime in South Africa? The raw numbers can be misleading if you don't take into account the adjustment for population size. The per capita rate gives a more meaningful comparison and helps identify the true hotspots. Because while I have taken largely more precaution in my own personal and private life and those around me, overall, you would be forgiven for not believing that overall national crime rates have largely remained stable over the last while or even slightly declining. Also, if you look at the number of reported crimes. There's a report by Dr. Simon Howell, who's a senior lecturer at the Centre for Criminology at UCT, in a paper that's about to be published, which says that 10% of South Africa's policing districts, or 10% of South Africa's police stations, report more than 50% of the crime in this country. And if you look at those numbers, what are we actually experiencing? Enjoying to me now on the line. Good morning, Simon. Really appreciate your time.
Hey, good morning, Lester.
Numbers are one thing, but there's also the perception and the feeling of being unsafe in South Africa. But when you look at the numbers and this report that you're about to publish, what does it say about the levels of crime, criminality, and criminal activity in South Africa, in how we experience it in South Africa?
Sure. Well, I mean, we typically, when we talk about the crime stats, we talk about the crime stats in isolation from everything else. So, I mean, every year or every quarter now, the crime stats are released and we say, oh, well, the murder rate went up or down or stayed the same. But we tend not to speak about crime in terms of in the context in which it occurs. And statistically, the way to do that is to talk about the crime rate, which is the number of crimes per 100,000 people. And if you look at the crime rate, presupposing that you know the population, which of course in South Africa is of itself quite a contentious topic because stats says they don't conduct regular census, and every census they do conduct is, well, the last few have been 10% samples, so you have to figure things out by virtue of some stats and the like. But nonetheless, presupposing all of that, what we find is that the crime rate has in some sense remained stable or gone down slightly over the last couple of years. Of course, that I mean, again, has a large caveat in the sense that it may be that people reporting crime has gone down over the last few years rather than the actual crime rate has gone down, which makes sense in the terms of a context in which people still battle to trust SAPS and SAPS battles to fulfill its mandate, etc. So I mean, the numbers say one thing. Of course, people's experiences of crime may be very different, and people do fear crime in this country quite extensively. I mean, one only needs to look at the private security industry and its size, or the amount of money people are willing to spend on alarm systems and the like, to realize that there is a tangible fear to crime in this country. But nonetheless, I mean, the stats point to the fact that crime is located in specific areas, and that those are the areas in which, if you're talking about resource deployment and the like, those are the places where resources need to be pooled more so than other places, simply because that's where a lot of the crime is occurring. And those areas can be anything from city centers to emerging areas on the outskirts of sort of peri-urban districts.
Yeah, but how can it be, Simon, that 10% of policing districts in South Africa have 50% of the reported crime in this country?
Well, I mean, so those districts may, or those precincts may, for instance, be city centers the like, which have very high crime rates. There may also be things like airports and the like, which, I mean, by virtue of having very small populations, but having very high levels of reported crime because they are transient hubs like that points to that concern. But, I mean, I think in South Africa, urbanization and crime have something to do with one another. And it's clear that on the whole, at least, urbanization and well, urban areas and highly densely populated urban areas have significantly higher crime rates. And we see this in Cape Town, of course, I mean, it's cashed out quite tangibly in the way in which crime develops and the where significant crime issues occur. I mean, we've discussed this many times before, I mean, think about drugs or gangs and the like. I mean, they are geolocated or stay or occur in specific areas more so than others.
There has been an increase. While the crime rate has been generally stable or slightly declining, we do see some increase in specific categories, and that's murder, aggravated robbery, assault. That has increased, but your research shows that is largely centered around an increased rate in organized crime, i.e., gang activity, and we use Cape Town and the Western Cape for that example, but also increase social issues. I largely believe the statistics that say I'm far more likely to be hurt, assaulted, even killed by someone that I know, maybe even someone that I love, than some bogeyman hiding behind a bush or an alleyway. And this is largely because of the high rates of alcohol consumption, socializing, us not able to deal with anger and aggression that we're far more likely to be hurt or even killed than being mugged or being even killed walking down the city street.
Sure. So I think, I mean, there's two points here. One is that there is the statistics show that there's a strong correlation between assault, attempted murder, and murder, which essentially are continuums of violence. So, it shows that, that it's not simply that murder occurs outside of a context, but rather that it's a result or the climax of a trend of violence between people. And as you mentioned, alcohol clearly fuels a proportion of that. And I think it's not only, that alcohol itself fuels that, but it's the way in which alcohol is consumed in this country quite frequently that is a concern. It's that, people tend to binge drink. And as a result, alcohol impacts us in a different way to it would be if you drank it slowly. And that fuels or that continues the violence. I mean, that of course occurs within the context of structural issues and social deprivation and economic marginalization. And I mean, these are things that we've spoken about and which have that set the table, so to speak, for the high levels of violence that we see. But that being said, I mean, there is also things like urban planning and the continued fragmentation of our cities and the issues around, the sort of history and of apartheid and the history that we've not really effectively dealt with. That creates the social structures in which crime becomes endemic. And I mean, from a broader perspective and from a long-term perspective, until such time as we deal with those contextual challenges, we are essentially chasing our own tails.
Statistics it's not just statistics that provide us with also a perception of safety or a lack of safety. And I use the example between Joburg and Cape Town city centers. The statistics will tell me that Cape Town city center is more dangerous because there's more reported crime here as compared to the Joburg CBD. And that is actually, it's quite interesting because I would feel far more safe, and just general difference in feelings of safety depending on whereabouts I'm which street and which little corridor I'm in the Cape Town CBD, particularly at night. But the statistics will tell you Cape Town CBD more dangerous because more crime is reported here. But I would feel generally, and I have been in Joburg CBD, Braamfontein, in particularly many a times at night, and I feel a different level of safety compared to Johannesburg and Cape Town, whereas the statistics would tell me otherwise.
Sure. Well, I mean, in individual terms, I mean, you may feel safer in Cape Town because, I mean, you are more familiar with the area. It's where you work and where you've lived, and so in that instance, then there's a personal relationship between you and the city centre that you don't have with Joburg that may impact your perceptions of safety. There is also the concern around, in Cape Town, one could argue that crime is reported more frequently than in Joburg or in the city centre of Joburg, and therefore, from a statistical perspective, it looks like there is more crime occurring in Cape Town, when in fact it's just that there is more reporting, and that in Joburg city centre, crime is significantly more underreported. That would need verification though, but that would also impact the statistical relationship between crime and city centers. So, on the one hand, it is a perception. Feelings of safety are ultimately a function of your individual understanding of an area and resonance with that area. Whereas the stats show that it's not simply that there is no crime, it's that crime may be of a different type, or that we may be reporting crime differently, all of which are never, really discussed in the crime stats when they are released every quarter now. It's simply that there is a number and a figure that we aspire to in terms of arrests, and that is deemed to be the best possible solution to everything.
We've focused a lot on urban crime, but let's talk quickly about the urban and rural dynamics, or the urban versus rural dynamic. Why do some rural areas have low volatility but still have high chronic crime?
Well, so in terms of urban or rural areas, you find, for instance, in the Eastern Cape, that there are significantly high levels of very serious crime, so murder and the like, whereas there are very low levels of petty crimes and less serious crimes. So in that instance, of course, there is, in the one hand, a conflict between rural understandings of and traditional framings of crime and the like in relation to constitutional framings, which may have an impact. But there's also, I think, the concern around that communities may be more widely dispersed, but equally closer together in terms of knowing one another. And as such, when crime does occur, it's of significant, generally of a serious nature, because it's directly related to individual relationships. Whereas, it's more difficult to steal things from someone because everyone knows each other in a different way that it doesn't occur in a city center. So, there are different dynamics, and more importantly, these dynamics need to be taken into account when we're policing, or when policing is undertaken, because the context is different and the communities may be different. And, it's one thing to have cluster-based community policing, for instance, in a city, but what does community policing mean in a rural area? And I think those conversations we don't typically have because rural areas are often left out of the conversation when it comes to crime and crime statistics and indeed policing.
Simon Howell, really appreciate your time, and thank you so much. Senior lecturer at the Centre for Criminology at UCT.